the teacher says this line is horizontal, this line is not horizontal. Any problems with that? Right? And again, these are really simple examples to illustrate the point. We're not actually going to teach this, but this is a simple example to kind of illustrate. So what's the problem with saying this line is horizontal, this line is not horizontal? What's wrong with that? There's nothing in the middle. We haven't shown the full range. So the idea here is it violates the difference principle, which states that examples of being horizontal and examples of not being horizontal, in other words, a non-example, should be alike except for the critical feature that you're trying to teach. In other words, you're trying to teach horizontalness, right? So students will think that a line has to be vertical to be not horizontal. So what we actually call this here is you need to have a minimum difference principle, which is the idea that whatever you present as a non-example has to differ from this in the smallest amount possible to make it not that first thing. And so all you would have to do to make it not horizontal is just tilt it up slightly. And then kids will get the idea, oh, that's all you have to do. It has to be perfectly horizontal, and any other differences. Right? And so you can take these principles, even though we're applying a really simple example, and apply it to more complicated things as well. So that's what it really should look like. All right, so how you juxtapose the examples matters. And so this is a really neat example of cleverness here. All right, we're coming up with a brand new concept called fudged. It means absolutely nothing, but I'm going to teach it to you here. And if I try to explain it to you, it would take a long time. I'm just going to go through the examples in an interesting world. Not fudged, 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 not fudged, fudged, fudged. Your turn. All right, now I did that in what, 10 seconds? You guys can get this 100% correct. All right, fudged or not fudged? What's that?
Fudged.
Yeah, it's fudged. This one? Right, this one? Yep. Right? And so by setting up examples in a clever way, I didn't have to give you a verbal explanation. You just knew. And so that's what direction instruction teaches you, is there are really clever ways to be more efficient with instruction. And that hasn't traditionally been a part of the classical model necessarily, but it's something we're adding because it's so clever. And especially for kids at the younger ages, those types of things really help you increase your rate. And so one of the things that we are concerned about in designing instruction is there are two main qualities you have to do as a teacher. You have to be effective and you have to be efficient. So anything you do has to be evaluated from those two perspectives. If you can be more efficient, there are a lot of advantages to that, because obviously kids who are behind, if you have kids that are here running ahead, they're doing great, and you have kids that aren't where you want them to be. These kids continue to learn. The kids that are behind, they need to run faster to catch up. So if you can be more efficient in your instruction, you can help those kids catch up. All right, so these kinds of problems are assigned, let's see here. The kinds of problems students are assigned also need to reflect a full range of examples. So one of the other things we do with Singapore Math does very well is when you present an example, you start with the simple examples, and you kind of take the same approach that we did in presenting to the homework. You take a simple example, you kind of change it up a little bit, and students, by the time they get to the end, they're doing something complicated, but each step along the way, they only take one little thing that they have to kind of stretch their mind around. And so we do the same thing. One of the things we know about fraction problems, just to pick on the fraction problems, because as Americans, this is something we just do not teach well. We tend to assign fraction problems that involve pizzas, pies, and other concrete items. Well, if you look at it, there's a great book by a Chinese professor. Actually, she came from China and became an American professor, but she's from China. And she's working at Stanford. And she did a study on math, and she found that American teachers and Chinese teachers have such differences in the way they teach things. There is a much different expectation in terms of the knowledge of math and the way that things are presented. So what Chinese teachers will do is they'll actually assign a full range of problems that uses the concept of fractions in more abstract ways, such as work problems. If Fred can finish the job in 5 hours, John can do it in 3 hours, how long will it take for both of them to do it? Now you may think, well, that's an algebra problem, but it's really not. It's an arithmetic problem. And if you teach arithmetic well, in the same sort of way that the Chinese teachers in this book do, and which is the same way that we do with Singapore Math, those problems that seem really difficult are actually arithmetic problems. The difference is that what we're going to teach in the classical charter school is what's called a profound understanding of fundamental mathematics. We're going to teach arithmetic to a much greater depth than students are used to. So when they get to algebra, they've already solved algebra problems like this, but with arithmetic. So then all you're doing is you're adding the letters in. Right? So it's a much different approach that will help kids really grasp the fundamentals of math. All right, The other thing for design instruction, generally speaking, another insight from the direction instruction folks, there are 4 forms of knowledge. So if you're trying to analyze things, there's verbal association, concepts, rule relationships, and cognitive strategy. So, you know, A, I, O, U are vowels. Concept of a vehicle is a generalization of cars and boats and trucks and things like that. Rule relationships, the higher the temperature, the more atoms move. And cognitive strategy would be something like the procedure used to carry numbers. And so the idea is that there are teaching techniques. Now, these are not the only teaching techniques, but these are good ways to present some of these things. If you're doing a verbal association, it's just presenting one example. If you're doing a concept, you do examples and non-examples, rule relationship examples and non-examples of the rules. And then cognitive strategy, you have to have all the prerequisite knowledge before you carry out the strategy. And so the idea here is the fundamental principle here is that knowledge must precede skill. And so instead of, interpret math and some of the other more progressive approaches to teaching math, they will go and say, well, kids will just discover the knowledge in the context of attempting to solve problems. That does not work very well. What we do is we make sure you have all the knowledge in place first, and then we teach you the cognitive strategy step by step. All right, so there are many more interesting principles like that. I'm sure I belabored it quite a bit. But the main point that we want to raise is teaching is an art. But it's also very technical, much more technical than people realize in terms of subtle little differences in presentation can make all the difference in the world in terms of kids having misconceptions. So we focus on the minutiae of presentation, the sequencing of content, and we regard the well-designed lesson plans as the heart and soul of educational improvement. Our focus is on the classrooms, on giving teachers the freedom to teach and be teachers, and to design instruction really, really well. That's our focus. So to improve teaching and learning, one of the things we have to do is make sure that we stick to the evidence to the degree that we can. And so there's some really well-intended but unproductive myths about teaching and learning that are prominent in education schools and are documented in these books, The Schools We Need and Misconceptions About Teaching. Dr. Vicki Snyder is an education professor I believe she's at the University of Wisconsin now, and Edie Hirsch is at the University of Virginia. He's actually not an education professor, he's an English professor that became interested in education after he realized that his freshman at UVA, which is considered a public Ivy League school, could not write. And he wrote this book called The Schools We Need, talking about the lack. The problem he found was the kids could write wonderfully about their relationships and their family, but if you asked them to write about anything substantive, they didn't have the background knowledge to do that. So he wrote a book called The Schools We Need that talks about how many of the things that we are doing really describes our schools to a T, about systematically building knowledge over time will help you acquire those critical thinking skills that you see here so much about in public schools and other schools. Critical thinking skills we value greatly, but you have to have the background knowledge first to be able to think critically about anything. So these are interesting things, and especially teachers who've been around for a while, and they have heard these terms used loosely. And so we're going to go ahead and talk about what these myths are. And by a myth, I hope you don't think I'm using that term too strongly. A myth, what we're defining as a myth, is something that's believed but isn't proven. Doesn't mean it couldn't be proven one day, but it's believed and it isn't proven. So learning styles is one of those things that a lot of people believe is true, but it really hasn't been proven. So the common belief is that students have, modalities, visual, kinesthetic, and auditory, and if you could somehow appeal to that, you could teach them better. It's a wonderful thought. It's a great idea, except that in practice, there isn't really empirical evidence that says it works. And so we've been looking at this for about 40 years, and studies have attempted to identify students' learning styles and you're a visual learner, so we'll teach you in a visual way. That actually didn't work. Did not provide an advantage. So they've been repeated under. The other problem with the myths of learning styles is it has different names over the years. This kind of makes it less credible because people keep redefining what it means. The current definition is visual, kinesthetic, and auditory, but it used to be global and analytical learners. And so we've been redefining this, but the basic idea is that we can't rely on this. It's a wonderful thought. This isn't to say that children don't have differences, that they don't have different personalities, that they may not, or that they don't learn in different ways. But it's saying if you're trying to use visual, kinesthetic, and auditory approaches to account for those differences, the evidence does not suggest that's going to help. So it's certainly true that students differ in their learning preferences, but the idea here, the fundamental principle we would follow is teachers should teach in the contents modality, the modality that's best for the content, and not worry about learning styles. doing otherwise actually can shortchange students, because what can happen is you end up dumbing down the content to try to make something visual that isn't supposed to be visual, or something auditory that shouldn't be auditory. And so that's the principle. So in other words, if you're teaching about science, science is typically a visual phenomenon, so it makes sense to do science experiments and things like that. But if you're teaching about English, obviously that's more verbal. If you're teaching kids about math and history, well, that's a very visual thing. So the idea here is that whatever you're teaching will probably lend itself towards one of these approaches. And trying to account for learning styles is really well intended and a wonderful thought, but at this point, we just don't have a way to do it effectively. There's another myth called multiple intelligences. The idea that there's linguistic intelligence and mathematical and spatial and all these different types, and if you design your lessons to appeal to kids who have different kinds of intelligences, that'll be more effective. Again, wonderful thought. I wish it were true. I wish we could use it in a way that actually would help kids learn better. But basically, mainstream researchers regard intelligence as hierarchical, meaning that kids tend to score better on both verbal ed math or lower on verbal math, and your scores in those areas kind of move together. And this MI theory, this multiple intelligence theory, is not regarded very well among mainstream psychologists. And even Howard Gardner, who invented the term, has said, and he's a professor at, I believe he's at Harvard now, he said he did not intend for it to be used as a blueprint for theory. It was really meant as sort of a way of trying to explain some things. And he even said he was uneasy about the way it's been applied to schools. In general, the way that this theory has been applied to schools is to dumb down the content. Is to say, well, you know, the child's not reading, so maybe they're just more of a visual learner, you know, those types of things. They just don't get it. Instead of looking at the nuts and bolts of the instruction that we would look at, oh, it's just a readiness thing, it's just, you know, student differences. It's been used to dumb down the curriculum. So what we say is, instead of concerning with multiple intelligence, is focus on a logical sequence of instruction that builds all the prerequisite skills, and students will, in general, do very well with that approach.